I figure this video will get your brushes wet. Hello everyone and welcome back to Small Soldier. This tutorial is all about painting 1/35th scale figures in oils. Good day, mine people, and welcome to another Small Soldier video. I would suggest getting yourself a drink and a snack, because this is a long one. First things first, I would like to thank Taesung Harmms for the review samples for this video. I'll put a link at the bottom of the page to Alpine Miniatures, and there will be a description at the top if you wanted to check out some of their product. I'm using a round jeweler's file here, and they're really good for soft resins and that type of material. The teeth are really fine and give a good smooth surface after it's done. And when you're cleaning up mold seams, just make sure you've got a really sharp blade. One thing I'll say about Alpine Miniatures is there's not a lot of cleanup involved. The mold seams are very soft to remove, and you can get to painting very quickly. Here I'm using some steel wool, and that is a really good sanding material, especially for resin figures. And you'll find you can get rid of all the imperfections really quickly with that. There is one step that most people I think forget about, and that is washing your resin figures. Resin is a little different than plastic because the materials that they use to mold resin may have a mold release in them a little more than a plastic model might. And you're handling it while you're building it, and you get all those greasy oils off your fingers and whatnot, you know, your bag of chips or whatever you're eating. And I always find, you know, for peace of mind, wash the figures, let them air dry, and then you're good to go and you don't have to worry about it. And you're still going to wash them after you've built them too, one more time, just to ensure that the primer sticks and, you know, you don't have paint flaking off later. And as you can see, the pin gauge just helps you to find that right diameter for using the right drill bit. And it just gets the job done a little quicker and easier. Now when you're using a motor tool, resin's a little easier because it doesn't melt like plastic does, but you still want to be careful to make sure those holes are straight and you don't go off and make a big hole through something and then you just got to make a big repair job later. I prefer to put a pin in each foot. I find for painting purposes it just makes things sturdier and the figure won't spin on your painting base. And you'll notice on the figure standing with just one foot up, I actually put 2 pins in 1 foot because again, when you're painting it on the base, it just makes him stop spinning when you're actually painting. There's nothing more annoying to me than painting a figure and it keeps spinning on you. So that's just a way I find I can secure them down better when I'm painting. Here I'm securing the pins with super glue or CA glue. After I secure each pin in, I use a little bit of the accelerator just to cure it so it dries faster. And there you saw I was just marking the holes for where I'm going to mount the figures into my painting bases.
Wow!
This is a little trick when you're trying to align 2 parts together with a pin. Just take a little oil paint, put it in the hole that you've drilled, put it into the part that you're trying to mount into, and it should leave a registration mark. Drill that out, pin it, and you're ready to mount, and it should fit perfectly. This is a product I use, Aves Epoxy Sculpt, for filling small gaps and large gaps. The reason I prefer it is because it's non-toxic, water soluble, and it doesn't shrink. So all you want to do is get 2 equal balls, the same size, and just mix those together so they're uniform and you don't see any striations in the putty. And once they're mixed up, you're ready to go and you can start filling those gaps.
I got blisters on me fingers!
Mr. Surfacer works great for a final check on your gap filling. So it'll fill in any little imperfection, you know, just to kind of check what you've done, because sometimes the epoxy putty will leave little gaps or holes. So it's the final thing I do before I get into the final finish of the figure before it gets primed. And the beauty of Mr. Surfacer is you can just remove it with a little lacquer thinner, Tamiya lacquer thinner, and a Q-tip, and you don't have to sand it off. It'll just smooth out real nice into that joint.
We got our own ammunition. It's filled with paint. When we fire it, it makes a pretty picture.
This is a selection of oils you may need when you're painting faces. I don't necessarily use all of them every time, but they're kind of the go-to for painting most Caucasian face tones. I always wick all the oils off onto a piece of cardboard. You want to get all that linseed oil out of the paint so that they dry matte. If you're interested to see how I appreciated these figures, check the upper right corner, and I'll have some videos linked there so you can go check those videos out. Here I'm following the pre-shading with the first layer of shadowing. Probably won't see a lot of contrast yet at this point. There's a lot more steps involved yet to create the shadows and highlights. But you'll see as I go along here, I'm starting to add some darker tones in, and I'll blend those with a soft brush. And just keep following your roadmap of your pre-shading. And you'll notice also I'm working very thin compared to what I might work on a larger scale figure. You don't want to build up too many layers of oil on such a small space. The better rule of thumb is thin it out. You'll find you get less buildup of oils and it just becomes a lot smoother. So for every layer of darks you put in, you want to put a layer of lights. You always want to have that push-pull between light and dark to get your proper contrast. And here I'm adding the highlights next to the darks and blending those in again with a soft brush. Don't forget about your cast shadows as well. What I mean by that is anything that, like a hat, will cast a shadow over the top of the face, or a cap, or a pipe, or anything that protrudes from the face will cast a shadow from your light, depending on where that light source is coming from. So just remember that when you're painting as well. Cast shadows are important as getting your facial tones right as well. Speaking of cast shadows, that's exactly what I'm doing here. I'm creating a shadow underneath the cap, a false shadow, so that it just reinforces that look of a shadow cast over the eyes. I'd post this picture of a head under a lighting source to show you guys exactly what I mean by cast shadows. The shadow is roughly at about probably a 50 or 60 degree angle coming down on the forehead, and if you look at that, you can see the way the light plays on those facial planes. You always have to think of it as a ball. A sphere will accept the light, and use that as a good reference point when you're painting. If you can find something as a reference, that's always good to use as well. Sorry about this next part. I kind of fade off into the corner of the frame here. It's sometimes hard to remember to keep yourself centered in the frame, so this is one of those instances. Sorry. Here I'm adding more highlighting to the face, and you'll notice it's starting to take a little more shape and the contrasts are starting to happen a little more. Like I said, you're always trying to make a push and a pull, so if your darks aren't dark enough, add some highlight in there and you'll be able to tell right away which way you have to go, if you have to darken things up or you have to lighten things. It's just a good way of checking yourself all the time and making sure that you're going in the right direction. Now I'm really starting to add in quite a bit of dark to the lower portions of the face, just so those planes are pushed back, like the nose, under the eyes, under the chin, under the lip, in the corners of the cheeks. and that's just going to start to give the figure a little more dimension and help reinforce all those deep planes in the face so that the highlighted areas really start to pop. I stated earlier what the captions are saying here about painting thinner with smaller scaled figures. You always want to use a thin mix on something this small. Like I said before, it just ends up smoother and you can blend things better, and they dry quicker as well, so you can get in and work them sort of like acrylics, but you've got more working time than with acrylics. Even though you're adding thinners to the paint, you're still getting more working time than you would with acrylics. Here I'm starting to add a little more fine detail, like the ball of the nose, the edges of the jaw, tip of the nose, around the lips, that kind of thing. So you see I'm not adding a full highlight all the way across, it's just sort of picking things out at this point. Here you can see I'm adding more orange tone to the face. This is where you can really start to see the figure come alive. It doesn't have as a dead a look as it did when you were just painting in the darks and lights. And you just want to place this around, you know, the thinner areas of the face, like the jaw, the cheekbones, around the nose, the crevices of the eyes, that kind of thing, where you get a little more blood flow in the face. There is something to be said about a well-sculpted figure as far as painting one. They are a lot easier to work on than a poorly sculpted figure, just for the fact that, you know, you're going to see facial planes, you're going to see detail, and really it's going to be a lot easier to have good results with a figure. So, you know, do yourself a favor, and when you're painting figures, if you can afford it, get something that's really good. Get some resin figures, get Alpine figures, or whatever, but You know, if you want to pull off a good figure in a diorama or just a vignette, your best bet is always going to be a resin or a better sculpted figure. Even some of the new Tamiya stuff that's come out is really good. Even some of the plastics that are coming out are really good as well. ICM, Mini Art, Masterbox, just to name a few. They've come out with some really good sculpts lately. Faces are good. Proportions are excellent, and the sculpting is getting up there as far as resin goes. So if you want to make it easier on yourself, is what I'm trying to say, get yourself some good figures. Don't work on some cheap, crappy things, because really, if you're trying to learn how to paint figures, those will not help you at all. Again, you can really see those oranges and reds really start making that face come to life and things pop.
It's magic.
So I guess the purpose of oils are the transparency of the color. You're always building layer upon layer of thin paint, just a skin, and you're able to see what's happening below it. So if you've got your dark and your light tones below, and you're looking for things to pop by adding in the orange and the reds, you're seeing that transparency come through, and it starts bringing things to life. Like I said before, things aren't so dead, they aren't so zombie-like looking if you don't add these colors in, and you just, you're adding your browns and your tans in. If you don't add the oranges or the reds, things can just really start looking zombie-like or vampire-like. Unless you're going for that look, you want to add those reds and oranges back in. Oh, and a hairdryer doesn't hurt either. If you have a hairdryer around, you can use that to speed the drying time up even more. For painting hair, I like to use acrylics. They're just a lot easier than the oils, just because they dry fast, and the hair area is so small, you really want to have things dry a little quicker so you've got time to build things up. You'll see I'm basically getting the shape of the hair with the initial acrylic color. I do go back in with oils later just to add some highlighting and shading, but you'll see here I'm glazing in sort of a blondish color to give the hair more of a blonde feel. So once you get in your highlights and your shadows with your initial lights and darks, then you go in with either orange colors or yellow colors just to get that blondie effect. If you've ever tried to paint eyes on a 35th scale figure, you know how difficult that can be, and trying to film something like that is even more difficult. So that's why I haven't filmed anything showing how to paint eyes in 35th scale. Basically, you're drawing a shape and adding a little fleck of white in there just to give it the impression of an eye. I'll get into more of a tutorial when I do something larger for eyes later on. Even though dry brushing is a technique that's sort of old school, there are certain parts of the figure I do get into and add a little dry brushing just to pop things out, to give things a little more light initially, and then I get into adding the oils later to tone that dry brushing down. And it's just a matter of blending those, the harsh line of the dry brushing, and creating softer highlights and shadows. And for an area like this, you're probably going to want to have a very fine-tipped brush, something that holds a good amount of paint when you're trying to flow it into areas like piping and that kind of thing. I'm adding white acrylic paint on the epaulette areas to just help the detail pop a little more before I add different effects later. Metallics are kind of something you want to stay away from for the most part when you're painting figures, especially small figures, because that metallic pigment can flake off and get stuck onto the areas you've painted previously, and it's really hard to get that out of there once you've got it in. So I tend to paint that out first if I'm going to be using metallics before I paint the surrounding areas around it. A little tip for black: when you're painting black, you want to start out with more of a bluish gray as your base color. If you start out at black right away, you've really got nowhere to go as far as your shadows. So I like to start at about a 60-70% grayish blue and then work up my dark tones. And I create my own black instead of using pure black. If you use all the primary colors and you mix those together, you can get a nice, really rich black tone. And it's just a matter of glazing those oils back in over and over again. So you'll notice here I'm laying in the initial shadows, and then I'll go back in and keep working those shadows with roughly the same color. I will alter the color a little bit depending on if I want it even darker or lighter, but for the most part you can use the same tone and just keep building that shadow up into areas. And that goes for highlights too. If you think of folds in clothing as cylinders, that's a good reference point to go off of. You can check out pictures of cylinders or look at drawings of cylinders, and you'll see, or tubes I suppose, and see how the light forms around those. And basically you're doing the same thing on the folds on clothing. Everything is especially folds, they're all cylinders kind of overlapping each other, and wherever your light source is coming from, that's where you're going to shade those cylinders. So just think of it that way, and that could make it easier for you to determine how to lay those in. This is where I've mixed the primary colors together, and you can see that's a very nice, dark, rich, blackish green. And that's perfect for laying in deep, deep shadows. And they're not going to be dead. Like if you use black as a straight shadow, I find things just are too harsh, and they get really, again, dead looking. Try to avoid blacks and pure whites as much as possible for that reason. I'm using acrylic colors here for the highlighting on leather areas. I like to keep it more in the orangish yellowy area when I'm highlighting leather, especially brown leather, or really any kind of leather, I guess. And you're just gonna kind of layer that in, building up those layers of acrylic color just till you get to the point of where you feel you've got enough highlighting there before you lay your darker oils in. And again, the dark oil, when you're adding your shadows, will tone down the harshness of that dry brushing. And again, you can glaze over top of the highlighting areas, so that if you do find it is a little too harsh, just add in like a brown glaze, and that'll kill some of that harshness. The next step on the pants is to add in your highlighting. And again, these are very thin glazes. I'm not using white. As you can see on the palette there, it's more of a greenish olive, I suppose, is what I'm using on that. And you just go around and kind of pick out all those highlights and keep going around the figure, and as you're hitting the higher areas of your figure on the higher planes, that's where you're going to add multiple layers of that same type of highlight color just to make things pop even more. So you're not adding highlights over and over to the full area of a fold. You're going to put in your initial highlights there just to give it volume and make it pop, and then from that point you're going to kind of observe things and add those highlights in as needed where you feel they need to pop just a little bit more, on the top of the knees, the top of the folds, on any kind of seams or that type of thing. You'll notice as you're adding your highlights, by using the tans and the yellows and the olivey kind of colors, depending on what you're painting, that those highlights will come across in some respects as a dusty tone, which is perfect because we're painting military figures and they are in environments of dust a lot of times. And by avoiding the white, which will give you a chalky appearance, those tans and yellows will give you that nice dusty effect that we're all looking for. And by building those tones up more and more, you'll create even more of a dusty effect, like around the bottom of the feet and the bottom of the pants. You can just blend those highlights in just even more, just to give it the effect that he's been walking through a dusty area. If it is, and depending on the environment they're in, desert or urban, they will have more dust on them. I find I can mix a really convincing field gray color with the oils using the 4 previous colors you saw in the photo there, or in the picture frame. And I tend to use probably more of the green and more of the yellow ochre, and then add in my little bit of brown and Payne's gray, just to give it more of a grayish feel, I guess, is to pull in the grayness of it. And depending on how much of the yellow ochre you use will determine on the shade of field gray you end up with. So it just depends on what you're looking for. If you're looking for more of a green based field gray or more of a gray or black field gray, it'll all depend on how much of those particular paints you're mixing in. And once you have your base color mixed, then you can start adding in some highlight and shadow colors. Here I'm getting a few darker shades of that particular color, and then I'll go in with more yellow ochre to create highlights. You'll see coming up here, I've painted in all the fine detail, metalwork, and all the decorations on the uniforms off camera, just again because it's too hard to show a lot of that to you up close as I am. This is what I'm talking about, Willis.
My rods and cones are all screwed up. I'm on no sleep. No sleep. Burning my brain. I'm stressed.
Yep, the old rods and cones are burning. I have to say, sleep has been very little over the last few days. Just editing this video and actually painting these figures took a long time as well. And again, sorry for not posting much lately, guys, but like I said, this one's taken a long time, and that's why this video is as long as it is. I hope you guys will learn a lot by watching this, and I hope you can see how much time I have and effort I have put into making this video. You can see here on the palette I have several shades of field gray mixed up, ranging from the greenish tones to more of the dark brownish blackish, and also that highlight corner up in the left there. And by using these 3 or 4 colors, you can gain a pretty good representation of field gray or any type of color. I do work, like I said, a little differently in small scale than large scale. It's all thinner applications of paint and really less mixes. I don't really have 3 or 4 highlights and 3 or 4 shadows. You only need a couple to get those tones right, and it's just a matter of layering, like I said earlier. And as the caption says, you can clearly see that there are varied shades of field gray from the photograph. So I really don't think there's any one shade that's right or wrong. It really depends on what you're going for, the shade you're looking for, and possibly the personality you're painting. This is where that white paint I painted earlier on all the metals and decorations came in. By using the white as your base for metallics, you can avoid those metallics and then take an HB pencil and just rub it over those white areas to give a metallic sheen. And that way it doesn't end up being a gaudy silver and sort of looking out of scale with the miniature. When you do go up in larger scales, metallics are useful and you can use them there just because they are larger. But the smaller you go down in scale, in my opinion, anyway, I feel that white is a better shade to use as your base. Obviously, you're not going to, if you're just starting out anyway, have this kind of result right away. But if you follow these steps and continue to practice, and practice makes perfect, as we all know, you can eventually get to this stage with your figure painting and possibly have really good results the more you work on a figure and really observe, like I said, the way light falls on an object, and try and understand, if you can, the principles of light and shadow. Study that a little bit if you've got a book on that. Read up on that and understand the basics of it, and you'll really be able to paint a much better figure if you do understand those principles. And of course, color theory comes into play too. So if you know your color theory, that really helps too, to create a figure that's more interesting to look at and colors that make sense to people, instead of just throwing in black and white as your shadow and your highlight and just going with that. And to me, that just never looks right, and it is just boring in my opinion. You want to pop in those colors as much as possible, and add purples and blues and yellows in your shadows and highlights. Don't just go with the straight black and white. It just makes for a overall more interesting looking figure, again, in my opinion. Most miniatures are painted with a lighting source from above. You can paint with a lighting source from below or from the side, but really that's a whole different animal and can be a lot more difficult to pull off. So if you just stick with your lighting source from the top of your model, that'll make life a lot easier for you for creating the shadows and highlights. And again, when you're using your pre-shadow with the airbrush, like I showed in a previous video, that will actually help you find the shadows and the highlights a lot easier than just kind of starting with base color and working from there. I'm not sure if I mentioned earlier, but by adding a little bit of thinner to the paint, and in some cases a lot of thinner if you're going for more of a glaze, that will help those oils dry a lot quicker. I find if I'm in a painting session, I can probably come back the next day and work over those oils again. If you're using oils straight out of the tube, you could be waiting at least 3 or 4 days, and in some cases, depending on lighter shades, they can take a lot longer to dry. So by adding that little bit of thinner in there, that just helps to keep things thinner and will help things dry much faster. Oh, I also forgot to mention that I didn't show painting the hands, but essentially it's the same thing as doing the face. You want to keep your shades the same as the tones used in your face, and do it really the same. You might have darker shades in the knuckle area and around in the fingers, but pretty much it's going to be the same deal. And here you can see I'm adding my shadows now into the camel pants, and basically you've got your acrylic base coat, and then just go in and start laying in really thin glazes, basically, especially on a camo pattern. You don't want to go too thick with the oils because it'll start obscuring the camo itself. So they're just very thin glazes, working them into all the deep shadows, and then you're going to go in with highlight colors later and pop out those protruding areas a little more. But with camo colors, you want to be a little more careful than you would with a solid color. You just don't want to lose the effectiveness of the camo, and you don't want it to get blended away in the oils. There are certain areas on a figure that you can essentially treat like a piece of armor or something more abstract. You can pop in washes to let it flow into seams, and where you've got two clothing pieces that separate themselves, like a jacket and a pair of pants. It's always good to just kind of drop a wash into that to give a separation, almost like outlining something, I suppose, but it's more of a concentrated wash as opposed to a thin glaze. Here I'm using a bit more acrylic to essentially dry brush in those leather areas again, just to pop out all those tiny details. I'm not sure if I mentioned earlier, but when I'm dry brushing these tones in, these are multiple applications of a dry brush technique. I may lay in one or two in one area and then 4 or 5 in another, depending on how much wear I want to imply on that item. So just observe and take a look at your reference photos to see how leather or certain clothing pieces are affected by weathering, and you'll get an idea of where to take it. I'd appreciate you letting me know in the comment section below if the long video like this is something you guys like to see. You know, do you like to see the in-depth painting sessions doing it this way, or do you like them shorter with less detail? I can do them either way. Just know that the more in-depth ones like this do take longer to produce and are a lot more draining on myself, I suppose. So the uploads won't be quite as frequent. Like here, I'm starting to pick out those fine details in the clothing, the seams, you know, the pockets, the areas that are protruding out just a little more. And I've also mixed up 3 different camo highlight colors there that you can see on the palette. So depending on the color I'm painting, I will paint those highlights with the separate color just so that they blend in and match a little better. Where that dry brushing earlier really pays off in spades when you're adding in your basically here I'm adding in a dark wash over all the leather parts. It's not black, but it's very close to black, and this is what will tone down all that harsh dry brushing. And once I get this in there, then I can start going in with multiple shades of the same color in less of a wash and more concentrated to certain areas to shade those particular spots. You can see here that this tone I've mixed up is very brown, and this is what I'm going to lay in as my shadow color once that wash has dried that I put over top of the dry brushing areas. And this is where you're going to start finding those shadows and drawing in the shapes, and then from there you can just keep adding darker shades to get your darker colors as you're going around all the folds and the shadows and the highlights. Even though the subject matter is drab and dull, being that it's a military uniform, the colors don't have to be drab and dull. And like again, I'm going to drive home that black and white color decision that a lot of people make. By keeping your colors more vibrant in the shadows and the highlights, by not using the black and white, you will make your figure stand out more and make it more attractive to the eye when people are looking at it. It just keeps the vibrancy there, even though it is a drab subject. You will, come out with better results, in my opinion. Here I'm using a stippling motion, and that is really good, a really good effect for simulating worn leather. And it's just a matter of building up that stippled pattern with multiple layers, just like you would any other effect. And it is really effective on leather items and the like. And as a final step, I always like to add a little bit of matte varnish to the figure, especially on some of the clothing areas. A lot of times the oils, as you're working them, will build up a slight sheen. Not necessarily all the time, but sometimes I find that the darker colors tend to want to give off a bit of a gloss. Even though you've taken most of the linseed oil out, it's just the way they work. So a little matte varnish around those areas will take care of that glossiness and give you a nice matte finish on the areas you want matte. And as you can see here, I am adding some white acrylic to all the medals and decorations on the uniform. This is a good base for a false metallic look. If you don't want to use a metallic paint, just paint everything that should be metal, or a white metal, in white, and then you go over it with the HB pencil, and that will simulate metal. And there are a couple spots there I just nailed on the uniform with some white. That's easy to clean up with a little bit of water because it is an oil-based surface. It washes off pretty clean. For the final crowning touch, a little bit of softer lead pencil. That will just perk up those metals and decorations and anything metallic and give it a little extra oomph. And as they say in the movie business, that's a wrap. I hope you learned something, and if you did, please consider subscribing, hitting the bell notification, give me a thumbs up, and please share if you feel someone can benefit from this tutorial. And as always, people, take care of yourselves, and
Auf Wiedersehen!